Monster in the Andes, The Hunt for Pedro Lopez. Introduction. A name whispered in three nations. In the misty valleys of the Andes Mountains, where borders between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru twist through rugged terrain and forgotten villages, a dark legacy still lingers. It's a tale not often spoken in public, but whispered behind closed doors by families who never found answers and police who never found closure. Between the mid-1970s and early 1980s, hundreds of girls vanished from rural markets, dirt roads, and schoolyards across these countries. Most were never seen again. For years, their disappearances were explained away: poverty, displacement, even superstition. But eventually, a chilling truth emerged. This was not coincidence. It was the work of a man named Pedro Alonso Lopez, later known as the Monster of the Andes. Lopez would eventually confess to killing over 300 girls, making him one of the most prolific known serial killers in modern history. Yet, despite the horrifying magnitude of his crimes, he served just 14 years in prison and was released. To this day, his whereabouts remain unknown. This is not just a story of a killer, it is a story of systemic failure, of silenced grief, and of justice left undone. Part 1: A Child of Violence. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in Tolima, Colombia in 1948 during one of the bloodiest periods in Colombian history. His early life unfolded against the backdrop of La Violencia, a civil conflict that claimed over 200,000 lives. Raised in a household gripped by poverty, his mother worked as a sex worker and had over a dozen children. Lopez described his childhood as violent, unstable, and emotionally barren. At the age of 8, Lopez was expelled from his home after being caught inappropriately touching a sibling. He fled to the streets of Bogotá, where he joined thousands of homeless children in a daily fight for survival. He later claimed that during this time he was taken in by a man who promised to help him, but instead assaulted and abandoned him. That incident, Lopez would later tell investigators, changed him. It was the beginning of a transformation from victim to predator. Prison and predation. By his late teens, Lopez had begun a life of petty crime, mostly theft and burglary. He was eventually caught and imprisoned. According to his own account, it was in prison that he became increasingly angry and resentful, especially toward authority and society at large. He claimed to have been abused while incarcerated and to have responded with violence. Whether these claims are entirely true is unclear, but what is certain is that when Lopez emerged from prison, he was no longer just a criminal. He had become a predator. By the early 1970s, he had begun traveling through Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, using falsified documents and aliases to evade capture. He frequently crossed borders, many of which were porous and poorly monitored at the time, making him difficult to trace. He claimed his first murders occurred in Peru, where he targeted girls from remote indigenous communities. He later told investigators that his victims were easier to approach in isolated towns, especially during festivals or market days. It's believed that many early cases were never reported, either due to fear of police, language barriers, or mistrust in government institutions. Part 3: The Pattern Takes Shape. By the late 1970s, reports of missing girls, usually between the ages of and 12, began to spike in Ecuador. Towns like Ambato, Cuenca, and Riobamba became hotspots for disappearances. Children would vanish while running errands, selling goods, or walking home from school. Often, there were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and no follow-up investigations. Many families were told to wait, that their child had probably wandered off. But the families knew better. The killer, it turned out, had a method. Lopez would observe his intended victims in busy areas, then offer small gifts, candy, toys, or trinkets. Once trust was gained, he would lead them away from public spaces and into rural or abandoned areas. He later told investigators that he felt a sense of power and control during these moments. But even more disturbing was his lack of remorse. In interviews, he described his crimes in cold, analytical terms, often referring to the victims in abstract rather than personal ways. Part 4: The Cracks in the Silence. In 1980, torrential rains near the town of Ambato, Ecuador, caused flooding that exposed a mass grave. a farmer discovered multiple bodies badly decomposed and buried in shallow dirt. The victims were young girls. The discovery shocked local authorities. For the first time, the scale of what was happening became undeniable. Soon after, Lopez attempted to abduct a girl from a busy market. This time, he was stopped by vendors and held until police arrived. During questioning, he remained calm and even offered his cooperation. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. Part 5. The Confession That Shook a Nation. Over the course of several interviews, Lopez confessed to killing more than 300 girls across Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. He described his methods in detail and led police to over 50 burial sites in Ecuador alone, most of which matched active missing persons cases. Local and international media quickly dubbed him the monster of the Andes. But despite the horror of his crimes, the justice system struggled to reckon with the scale of what he had done. In Ecuador, where he was tried, the maximum sentence was 16 years, regardless of the number of victims. He was convicted of 110 murders, but served just 14 years due to good behavior. In 1994, he was released. Part 6: Release, Psychiatric Evaluation, and Disappearance. Lopez was immediately deported to Colombia, where authorities hoped to try him for additional crimes. He was placed in a psychiatric facility in Bogotá and deemed criminally insane. He remained there for 4 years. In 1998, he was declared sane and released after paying a small bond. Since then, Pedro López has disappeared. There have been rumors of rearrest, alleged sightings in border regions, and speculation that he may have returned to isolated parts of Colombia. But no official record confirms his fate. Today, he remains a fugitive, with an Interpol warrant still active. Part 7: A Ghost That Still Haunts. What makes the case of Pedro Lopez especially horrifying isn't just the magnitude of the crimes, it's the failure to stop them. Weak intergovernmental coordination, outdated sentencing laws, a lack of attention to the victims, many of whom were from indigenous and poor families that had little voice in the legal system. His case highlights how serial violence can thrive in silence in places overlooked by global media, in communities cut off by poverty or language, and in legal systems unequipped for horror on this scale. Pedro Lopez didn't disappear into legend. He disappeared into bureaucratic cracks and ignored suffering. And unless he is found, those cracks will remain open. The Silent Stalker, the story of Daniel Camargo Barbosa, a trail of lost daughters, a killer who hid in plain sight. Introduction: The Shadow of Evil. In the humid coastal cities of Ecuador and Colombia, the 1980s were marked by political instability, economic hardship, and a quiet horror moving among the people. A horror not caused by war or disease or corruption. It moved silently, without fanfare, without a face. But girls were disappearing. It wasn't until a horrific discovery in Guayaquil, Ecuador, that police began to connect the dots. Someone had been targeting young girls, intelligent, kind, often from underprivileged families, luring them away under false pretenses and leaving behind a growing trail of heartbreak. At the center of this unfolding nightmare stood Daniel Camargo Barbosa, a man who would ultimately confess to the killings of more than 70 young girls and who would escape prison not once but twice. He was calm, soft-spoken, courteous, and utterly remorseless. Part 1: The Formation of a Killer. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was born in Colombia in 1930 into a poor and emotionally fractured family. His mother died when he was very young, and he was raised by a harsh disciplinarian stepmother. From an early age, Daniel was intelligent, described by his teachers as academically gifted, but also emotionally distant. As a teenager, he became obsessed with purity and morality, particularly surrounding women. He resented what he perceived as promiscuity, and by the time he reached adulthood, this obsession had curdled into a disturbing pattern of control and judgment. By the 1960s, Camargo had already been arrested several times for assaults on young women, but the full extent of his pathology wouldn't become clear until much later. He became known to Colombian authorities as someone with a fixation on young girls, a preference for manipulation over violence, and a disturbing ability to appear normal, even charming. In the mid 1970s, Camargo was finally arrested for a series of attacks and convicted of multiple crimes. He was sentenced to 25 years in Colombia's Gorgona Island prison, an infamous remote penal colony off the Pacific coast. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. Part 2, The Escape and the Slaughter. In 1984, Camargo did the unthinkable. He escaped from Gorgona Island, which was considered nearly inescapable due to shark-infested waters and strict surveillance. Authorities believe he used a makeshift raft to reach the mainland, then vanished. From there, he made his way south to Ecuador, crossing borders with forged documents and a changed identity. There, the killings began again, but this time, more calculated, more prolific. His method was chilling in its simplicity. Camargo would pose as a foreigner, sometimes claiming to be a lost tourist or a wealthy businessman, and approach young girls in marketplaces or near schools. He often claimed he was looking for someone to help him learn Spanish, or that he had a job opportunity for a family in need. He appeared educated, clean-cut, and non-threatening. He was the kind of man people trusted. He was the kind of man who used that trust as a weapon. Over the course of just over a year, dozens of girls, mostly between the ages of 9 and 14, began to vanish in and around Guayaquil and Santo Domingo de los Colorados. Unlike other killers who were chaotic or violent, Camargo was methodical and patient. He kept track of the victims, their clothing, their locations. In one chilling discovery, authorities found a notebook in which he'd written down details about each girl, including where he met her and what she was wearing. It was as if he were collecting data, keeping score. Part 3, The Arrest and the Revelation. In 1986, Camargo was finally apprehended. Police found him wandering near a forested area outside Guayaquil, acting suspiciously. When they questioned him, they discovered children's clothing in his bag. At first, he denied everything. But once alone in the interrogation room, something shifted. In a calm, detached tone, he began to speak. He confessed to 71 murders in Ecuador alone and claimed responsibility for dozens more in Colombia. He told police how he had selected his victims, how he gained their trust, and how he disposed of their bodies in forested areas where he believed they would never be found. What stunned investigators most wasn't just the number of victims, it was Camargo's demeanor. He showed no remorse, no anger, no sadness. He explained everything as if reciting facts from a textbook. The man who had once escaped a high-security island had now become one of the most prolific serial killers in Latin American history. Part 4, The Monster Behind the Mask. During psychiatric evaluations, Camargo was found to be sane, fully aware of the nature of his crimes. He exhibited signs of antisocial personality disorder with an extremely high IQ and a frightening capacity for deception. In media interviews, he blamed society, women, even his upbringing for his actions. He claimed to be punishing girls for the perceived sins of others. His delusions were not random. They were driven by a twisted sense of moral superiority. This sense of righteousness is what separated Camargo from other killers. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as a judge. In his mind, he was exacting a warped form of justice. But the justice system had its turn. Camargo was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time, despite the horrifying number of his victims. He was sent to Litoral Penitentiary, one of Ecuador's most overcrowded and dangerous prisons. And it was there in 1994 that Camargo's story ended, not by legal means, but by prison justice. He was murdered by the cousin of one of his victims, stabbed repeatedly in his cell. There was no trial, no appeals, just the silence that followed. A legacy of shadows. The case of Daniel Camargo Barbosa exposes not only the terror one man can inflict, but the vulnerability of an entire system unprepared to stop him. His crimes happened across 2 countries, with limited coordination between law enforcement agencies and lenient sentencing laws that failed to reflect the scale of his evil. To this day, dozens of families never recovered their daughters, and some of Camargo's victims have never been identified. He died as he lived, in silence, in the shadows, surrounded by walls, but never truly brought to justice in a court of law. His name is rarely mentioned today. But for those who remember him, and for the families still grieving in Colombia and Ecuador, uh, the memory of his crimes is not a chapter of history. It is a wound that never closed. In the end, the stories of Pedro Lopez and Daniel Camargo Barbosa converge in a chilling reality. Two men, born in the same country, exploiting the same vulnerabilities and leaving behind similar trails of devastation, yet shaped by vastly different motives. Lopez was a compulsive predator driven by trauma and a deep-seated rage, vanishing into the shadows after unleashing one of history's most prolific killing sprees. Camargo, by contrast, was a calculating strategist who cloaked his crimes in warped morality, ultimately meeting a brutal end behind bars. But at the heart of both men's crimes was an unspeakable commonality. They were child predators who specifically targeted young girls, using trust, charm, and manipulation as their weapons. Their ability to repeatedly victimize society's most innocent and vulnerable reflects not just the horror of individual evil, but the catastrophic failure of the systems meant to protect children. Their legacies are not merely tales of crime, but haunting indictments of justice denied, lives stolen, and the darkness that often hides behind a polite smile or a calm voice. Thank you for listening to this episode. These stories are never easy to tell nor easy to hear, but they matter. The lives lost to predators like Pedro Lopez and Daniel Camargo Barbosa deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, but as daughters, sisters, and loved ones whose voices were stolen far too soon. By shining a light on the darkest corners of human behavior, we not only honor their memories, we confront the uncomfortable truths that still echo in our world today. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and join us next time as we uncover more of the untold stories behind history's most chilling crimes. Until then, be safe and keep your eyes open. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a smile.